The next genus we're going to talk about is Rickettsia, and this is another one of the obligate intracellular bacteria similar to the chlamydia organisms that we've already talked about. Again, these organisms cannot make enough ATP in order to sustain life, so they have to utilize the host cell's ATP. Therefore, they're obligated to replicate inside of the host cell. You can see this huge list of rickettsial organisms. We are really going to focus on Rickettsia rickettsii, which is the causative agent of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. I wouldn't worry so much about most of the other species that are listed here. The only one that is of somewhat importance is maybe Rickettsia prawaziekii, and that's because it is spread by the vector, the human body louse. So you'll see this particular disease in times of overcrowded conditions. You see it a lot in times of war. You'll see it a lot in prisons where, again, the sanitation isn't really at its highest. So if there is a scenario like that or a vignette like that that mentions that, then you want to think about prawaziekii. Otherwise, we're going to focus on Rickettsia rickettsii. Now, what is the reservoir for this? The reservoir are rodents and actually domestic animals like dogs, for example, where the vector is the tick. So the vector actually spreads the disease. The tick in this case, though, is the dermacenter tick and not the ixodes tick, as we saw, that was really specific for Borrelia burgdorferi. Similar to what you see with Lyme disease, because we're talking about a tick bite injecting the organism into its victim, the organism's going to invade the vascular endothelial cells, causing vasculitis, but again, hitting a lot of target organs. Rocky Mountain spotted fever really is a medical emergency. It's not something you want to mess around with. Fortunately, it's usually very easy to diagnose. So let's look at the prevalence. Again, we have talked about a few different areas of the U.S. We talked about the desert Southwest, talked about the Northeast, and Rocky Mountain spotted fever is unfortunately not prevalent in the Rocky Mountains. It is prevalent in what we call the tick belt. So if you start in the U.S. from about South Carolina, going north to North Carolina, and then heading west, you're going across Tennessee, and then stopping at approximately Oklahoma, we'd actually call that the tick belt of the U.S., okay? With North Carolina being the highest incidence state. So if they mention somebody hiking, camping in North Carolina, bells should go off and you should really start thinking about Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Now, you look at the symptoms for Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and without the rash, you've got something that is alarming enough. You have headache, fever, and vomiting, malaise, and confusion. Now that is similar to what you see with meningitis. So you're already going to be on alert for something serious. And then, hopefully, you'll get to see the rash. The rash is extremely helpful and diagnostic. The rash is a maculopapular rash that starts on usually the ankles and wrists, then moves up the extremities, and then spreads to the trunk, the palms, and soles. And it's usually like this pinpoint, eventually petechial rash. So we're starting on the ankles and wrists, moving through the extremities, and then on the trunk, and eventually the palms and soles are going to become affected with that rash. So with this particular rash, you have to catch where it starts and how it progresses, because that's one of the key diagnostic features for Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And the rash formation itself is called a centripetal rash because of the way it moves inward. Now, what are some of the other diagnostic features of this particular illness? You can get a lot of edema in the ankles and wrists, but the diagnosis can be a little bit confusing. Again, if you see it initially without the rash, it can look like meningitis. You have periorbital swelling that you might see in some parasitic diseases, for example. Stiff neck and conjunctivitis, you can, again, think meningitis. You might even think pestis. So lots of confusing symptoms in here. If you don't spot the rash, this can be a nightmare. Luckily, most of the patients get the development of the rash, so that makes it a pretty easy pickup. On the step 1, they will tell you about the rash. They're not going to try to confuse it by all the other symptoms and not tell you about the rash. They're definitely going to tell you about the spread of the rash. Now, as far as diagnosis, it's going to go based on the rash predominantly. You always start treatment right away because, again, it's a medical emergency and has a high fatality rate if it's untreated. Now, serologically, the indirect fluorescent antibody test is used, and you can look for a 4-fold increase in titer. That's diagnostic. Are they going to tell you that? Probably not. One of the things they like to tell you, again, kind of goes back to the quelling reaction that we really don't use so much anymore. But with Rickettsia rickettsii, there is something called the Weil-Felix test. The Weil-Felix test is when you get the cross-reactivity of rickettsial antigens with antigens from Proteus. Now this test, the Weil-Felix test, is no longer used. Remember, grandmas writing the questions, she don't know, she's not keeping up, I don't have a computer, Google, what? So anyways, they're still going to mention it's Weil-Felix positive. Even though, gone, don't use it, you have to know about the Weil-Felix test. So Weil-Felix positive speaks to Rickettsia rickettsii. How are we going to treat it? Doxycycline is the drug of choice for Rickettsia. And again, going back to prevention always goes back to helping eradicate that insect vector.